All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that we're a few minutes after, but I had to get set up a little bit. So get settled, get in your seats, and then we'll get started. All right, let me open this up in prayer, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Father in heaven, we thank you again for this time that you've given us this morning. Thank you for the opportunity to gather in this way, giving us the opportunity to worship, to tell you how much we love you for what you've done for us. We thank you for the opportunity to study both through Scripture and through history. We thank you for this class and the opportunity to go through history and to see your influence in it. We thank you as we started last week and as we're continuing to pick up. We thank you for the folks that are here. We ask that you bless our time of conversation. Be with me as I deliver the lesson from week 2, Lord, that you just help me to be able to convey the points that you want me to convey, and that the class would be able to receive that which you want conveyed. And so we just pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, so last week we were kind of setting the stage of, looking at this class, the overall timeline, what we're going to be covering. And so, as I had mentioned, we're going to be going through the first 7 presidents. And so today we're going to be going through the presidency of George Washington. We're not going to dive into his presidency, doing a deep dive. It's more of kind of like a history of his early years, his early military career, and then what he did during the presidency. But really what I want to zero in on is what Washington did as his farewell address. So in declining a third term, he actually wrote an 18-page farewell address that he didn't actually deliver publicly. It was actually published in the papers, laying out why he wasn't doing it, but also giving advice to the fledgling country of the things that they need to avoid. And I've kind of summarized them into 4 main pillars, and we're going to use those pillars as an anchor point through the rest of the class. And you're going to see from after Washington, for each subsequent president, we're going to be able to see how some of those things were deviating from the very pillars that Washington would set out. Right? So if we think about George Washington in his early years, he was born in 1732 in Virginia. He was one of 9 siblings. And when I was looking at this, I kind of chuckled to myself. I'm like, George Washington could be an honorary Indian, because with Indian families, like our parents' generation, that's what it was. You were one of 8, you were one of 9, you were one of 10. And so, but the reason that this was the case, right, is because George's dad had to marry twice. So George's dad, Augustine, would marry his first wife, Jane Butler, in 1715. They would have 4 kids. George Washington would not be one of those children. So what would happen is Jane would die in 1729, and leading Augustine to remarry in 1731 to Mary Ball. And so after he would remarry to Mary Ball, their firstborn son would be George of that second marriage. And so they would actually have 6 children together, including George. And so the average life expectancy at that time, if you had to take a guess of what the average life expectancy would be. Very close. Who said 30? Very good. 33 was the average life expectancy at that time. So think about that, right? If you think about the average life expectancy, being 33, right? Lots of childhood diseases that, either are cured or non-issues today were, really big problems back then, and in most cases lethal. So it was very common for men and women to remarry, for either men and women to die in their first marriages, remarry. So this was very, very common. And so when you think about, in George Washington's case, it becomes really interesting because of the fact that he had so many siblings, and because of, the fact that many people would die during that period. Most kids, right, if you had to take a guess of a percentage, what percentage of children born during this time would live to see their 20th birthday? Someone said 50. That's sort of close. It's less than that. It was actually 40%. So 40% of children born during this period lived to see their 20th birthday, right? And so when you think about that, right, not only that, if you think about childbirth, again, what we were talking about, 1 in 8 women died during childbirth during this period. And now the crazy thing is, when you think about these stats, is that George Washington would actually outlive all of his siblings, even though he was the oldest. And so when you think about the circumstances that he's operating under, he would actually write that he is now the last of his siblings and of his family when he would, as he would write after his siblings would pass. And so given the circumstances, it's interesting that George actually ends up surviving, being the oldest sibling, and he goes on to do a number of things, right? So if we think about that today, if you think about this period, only 2% of the population during that time lived to be 65 years old. Compare that with our life expectancy today, which is, as of 2024 data. Take a wild guess what our life expectancy is today. Who said 79? Oh, I thought I heard 79. I was like, that's really good. Yeah, it's 79. As of 2024 data, the life expectancy in the United States is 79. So 2% living to 65 during that period. We have a larger majority living to 79 today, right? So why is this interesting, right? Because where he grew up, like George Washington grew up in Mount Vernon, which was in Virginia. The compound is still there. It's a historical site. You can go visit. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do there. Now, what's interesting is that he grew up during a period where, Great Britain had established colonies in the New World, right, on the Atlantic seaboard, so Virginia being one of them. So at age 17, he would end up becoming a surveyor. Anybody know what a surveyor is? Yeah, so what's a surveyor? Yeah, people that go out and map boundaries and lands, and they would use that to create maps and legends and things like that, right? So he would become a surveyor. This is important because this is actually going to serve him well as he ends up becoming, as he goes into the military. So what he ends up doing is, as he's in Mount Vernon, one of his neighbors is a very famous British lord by the name of Lord Fairfax. He was an influential leader in Virginia, and their family was very affluent. Now, the thing is with George Washington, unlike his brothers, George Washington actually didn't get a formal education. He would go through the standard education of going to like a church school and things like that, whereas his brothers would actually be formally educated. And so what he ended up doing, he would spend a lot of time at the compound of Lord Fairfax, and he would learn from Lord Fairfax the ways of British society. He would learn habits. He would learn how things would operate. And then he would actually get his surveyor's license at the age of 17 from the College of William and Mary, become an official surveyor. And he would end up doing that for 3 years, becoming a very skilled map maker. Now, this would open a lot of doors for him in his military and political career because of that history. Now, what's interesting is that a few years later, after doing this, he would actually travel to Barbados with his younger brother Lawrence, and contract smallpox. Now, the funny thing about smallpox, right? Like then, it killed you, right? There was no vaccine for it. There was no protocol to deal with it. But he would get this at an earlier age. He would actually survive the bout with smallpox, develop natural immunity to it, and then during the War for Independence, there would be a massive smallpox epidemic that would rage the army, which would take so many soldiers, but Washington would survive, right? He actually wouldn't even get infected because he had already had natural immunity. Again, it's just interesting, some of these little things that would actually affect him during that time that would build sort of the case for what he would end up doing, almost as if he was kind of being singled out a little bit for something that he was going to do. I mean, I'm not going to go so far as to say it, but it's kind of hard to avoid some of these things, especially as we kind of unpack some of this other stuff that we're going to see in George Washington's life. So one of the major times that he ends up in a military position, he ends up enrolling and he ends up as a major at the time. And so his first military action would come in 1755. And so in 1755, that entire year becomes interesting because the British had made inroads in the New World, and like any major power, they said, okay, well, we claim all of North America, right? Well, they weren't the only ones who were here. The French were also here, right? So the French, they were like, well, we also claim North America, right? And so the French and the British clearly were always at odds during this period. And so because they were always at odds, what they ended up doing was the French were noticing that the British were advancing in what they were doing. So because of where they were in Virginia, and if you looked at a map of Virginia during the colonial period, it was massive. Like it was really big. It's not anywhere near where it is today. But what the British were doing was they were actually creating trading posts. They were actually engaging in trade with the natives. They were finding different ways to create commerce, and they were continuing to expand westward. Well, the French were in the north and in the south. So the French had come into Canada, modern day Canada, and they would have Montreal and Detroit, which would be the areas that they operated of, as well as to the south in St. Louis and in New Orleans. And so what what the French king wanted to do is like, well, he's seeing that the British are advancing more in the New World. He wanted to blunt their advance and wanted to have France do more advancement in the New World. So what he ends up doing is he starts agitating the British. So he's telling his people, he has a major general who's in the New World at this time. And what he tells them to do, he goes, I want you to just go and start building forts all over the interior of the New World, and I want you to start encroaching on where the British are, meaning going into Virginia and into Pennsylvania. And I also want you to start selling to the same natives that the British are selling to, because they wanted to undermine the influence that the British had. And so this would start to come to a head where the governor of Virginia at the time would send George Washington and another man by the name of Christopher Gist to deliver a message to the French general. The name's general is General St. Pierre, who was commanding the forces in the area to find a diplomatic solution. Because what was happening is the French weren't just simply going and being agitators. They would actually start destroying existing forts. They would start taking British nationals captive. They were being very pretty messed up, right? Like, and the British, because if you ever study how the British fight, the British fight in a very orderly manner, right? And they're expecting the people that are fighting them are going to fight in an orderly manner, right? The French weren't doing that. The French were not being civilized. They were being anything but civilized. And so they're trying to figure out a diplomatic solution to this. So they send George Washington and Christopher Gist to deliver a message to General St. Pierre. Now, they eventually get there, but the exploits, because George Washington would write down, he was a prolific writer, so he would always keep journals and write letters. And so he journaled this entire trip, which was treacherous to begin with. And there's some crazy things that happened in that trip. I'm not going to cover it now, but after delivering that message and eventually making it back to the governor, so he delivers the message to the French, say, yeah, thanks, no thanks, we're not doing this. The general says, I have been directed by the king to do this, and I'm going to do this. Tell you what, hang here, I'm going to give you an official letter telling you that this is what we're going to do, too bad, so sad, right? So he makes George Washington and Gist wait, gives them the letter, they make their way back to Virginia. And by the time they make it back to Virginia, once they read, oh my gosh, this is what he did, they actually were so impressed with what George Washington ended up doing just to get there, that actually was a major contributor to getting him into the service. And so, in 1755, in February, so the French would actually build this massive fort called Fort Duquesne, right? Which is now what's considered modern-day Pittsburgh, right? So they build this massive fort, and so they're encroaching on British territory, right? And so when George Washington was there, he was taking notes of all the stuff that the French had, the number of boats, the number of soldiers, the number of sentries. He was just trying to get all that information. And so when he relayed that back to the governor, who then relayed it back to King George would send his best general, General Braddock, who would be another player in the War for Independence, but we're not going to cover that now. We cover that in part one. So he would send General Braddock to the area in February with 2,300 soldiers, with a contingent of 2,300 soldiers with the simple goal of crush Fort Duquesne, force the French out, right? Braddock had heard about the exploits of George Washington and asked George Washington, would you want to join me on this trek, on this battle? He goes, absolutely. And so George Washington at the time would manage a group of militia people they would call the Virginia Buckskins. There were 100 soldiers that he would manage. And so those 100 soldiers would join the 2,300 soldiers that Braddock had, and they would start marching from where they were in Virginia all the way out to where Fort Duquesne was. Now, there's no roads, there's nothing like this, right? And you have this massive contingent that's making its way. So they start in February, and they only get to within a few miles of Fort Duquesne by July. Okay, so that's how long it's taking them to get to this point. So they get to within 7 miles of Fort Duquesne, and this is in July 1755. General Braddock is like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. We're going to keep some of the troops back here, continue to make the way over there, but I'm going to take a contingent of my better soldiers, and George Washington, I want you to come with me. So General Braddock takes 1,200 people plus the 100 people that George Washington had, and they make a massive push towards Fort Duquesne. Problem is, again, they're marching through in an orderly fashion like they do, right? They're just double timing it. But they go into a wooded area that's a ravine. They end up being ambushed by the French and the local Indians, who are now becoming loyal to the French. So they go into this battle, and they're getting completely ambushed on both sides. They're getting hit from front and back. The French and the Indians are attacking from the trees, from behind rocks, from under logs, whereas the British soldiers are side by side, loading up, trying to fire back. clearly they get slaughtered, right? They get absolutely destroyed in this battle. And so much so that George Washington, this is the crazy thing, like the records capture that George Washington was going back and forth delivering commands from Braddock to the troops back and forth on the battlefield, and somehow doesn't get shot, right? He's not getting hurt, he's not getting hit. Now, the crazy thing is, during the battle, the French and the natives specifically, they end up saying that they want to target all the mounted officers because they knew if they took out the mounted officers, they could scatter the rest of the soldiers because the soldiers would start to panic. And that's exactly what they ended up doing. So this fight, because they got ravaged, right, they would end up taking out 777 of the 1,300 total soldiers, right? So the 1,200 that Braddock had, the 100 that George Washington had. The majority were on Braddock's side. There were only, I think, 30 or so that were injured on George Washington's side. Now, all of the mounted officers would be shot and killed, including Braddock, who would die in battle. George Washington would be the only mounted officer who would not be injured in that battle. So what happens is word of this slaughter makes its way back to Virginia, right? And so as he makes his way back to Virginia, the story's told that the entire unit was killed, right? All 1,300 people, right, were dead. So everyone assumed that George Washington had died. So what happened is, during the battle, after Braddock is killed, George Washington assumes command, and he's like, we need to get out of here. So he's rallying the troops, and he gets them out of there. So once they're within a safe distance away from the ambush, he writes a letter because he had heard that somehow they thought everybody died. So he sent correspondence back to Virginia to say, hey, we didn't die. There's some of us, we're on our way back. And so they make their way back to Virginia, and he gives the full story, right? And as he's back in Virginia, this is the crazy part. As he's relaying the story, he's still wearing the jacket that he had during the battle. Takes the jacket off. There are 4 bullet holes in the jacket. Not hit once. This is all documented. This is not made up. This is all documented. So Washington gets shot at multiple times, not touched. Multiple horses were being shot from under him. He had not been scratched. And then he goes on to say this. He quotes this in his writings. He says, I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation. And this will be the first among many instances of over 250 in George Washington's writings where he's referencing the providence of God. This is not just some, random passing notion that he's saying. Washington firmly believed that he was kept protected because of the providence of God. And he would repeat that term multiple times in his writing, right? And so 15 years later, after this battle, so the battle happens in 1755, in 1770, you get even more corroboration of what happened in this battle. So in 1770, you get to this battle, and he finds that in 1770, he's back in that same area, in that same wooded area in the Pennsylvania region where the battle happened. And a local chief happened to hear that Washington was there. And he makes his way, he travels out to meet Washington, catches up with Washington, says, hey, can we sit and have a meeting? Washington's like, sure. So they go and they sit and they have this meeting. And he tells them, and this is the crazy thing, this older Indian chief was in the battle with Washington. He was the one in charge of the braves that were aiding the French during that battle. He actually told his braves that you need to take out the British officers. This is your job, right? And then he tells Washington, he goes, my rifle has never missed. And I shot at you multiple times, and nothing happened. And because nothing happened, I told my braves, stop shooting at the man, because he is protected by the Great Spirit, and to leave the man alone, because he was like, if that man is being protected, clearly I don't want to piss off the Great Spirit, so just start shooting everybody else, right? And so he would go on to say, and he would write this, the chief would actually write this. He said, I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I have come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle. Written by the local chief who was in the battle with Washington, tried to kill him, couldn't, and recognized that something else was at play. So before I get into the presidency bits, we have to tackle, I said I would tackle some controversies, right? So we have to tackle one of the controversies that are typically tied to Washington, and that has to deal with slavery, right? So when we think about, there's three questions, right? So did Washington own slaves? Yes, right? However, let's understand why he owned slaves. So during this time, and I'll unpack this in Virginia, he didn't buy slaves outright. His father had slaves, Augustine. When his father passed, when he was 11 years old, he inherited those slaves by virtue of the law. That's how the law worked. Now, when he was 11 years old, he's not doing anything with these slaves, but he grew up around slavery. This was a normal practice at that time, right? They had not come into the consciousness of saying that this was wrong. And so during the period that he would grow up in, he would grow up around slavery, and then he would inherit these slaves. And then as he got older, more slaves would be added to the compound. As he marries his wife, Martha, Martha would have her own slaves, not that were hers, but that were with her first husband. And so when her first husband died, she was given the slaves, but Virginia law made it impossible for her to free the slaves because they were with her husband. And so the only way that she could free the slaves would be to sell them. She could not free them. Virginia law made that impossible. In fact, Virginia law during that time, in the colonial period, they passed, you could compare it to the Byzantine tax code that we have today with the IRS. They did something very similar for slavery. They would, in every single session that they had, they would come up with different rules that would be added on top of the mix of slavery rules that they had, which would make it incredibly difficult to emancipate a slave. And so the thing is, did Washington view slavery as wrong? Yes, and we know this because the historical record tells us that he did not have a positive view of slavery, especially once the colonial people started to realize that they wanted their independence from Great Britain, and they were realizing how they were being treated by the king and by the British, and they wanted their freedom. It dawned on them oh my goodness, slaves want the same thing. These people have been brought here, forced into service. They too desire freedom. Why are we doing this? And so George Washington, starting in 1772, once he began to serve in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is what they called it at the time, as the British version of the state house or the state Congress, he would urge the king to stop the importation of slaves in Virginia in 1772. They would actually send a letter to the king. The king would refuse. In 1774, he would chair a meeting in his own home with a bunch of people, and the statement that gets produced out of that meeting is, "We take this opportunity for declaring our most earnest wishes to see the entire stop forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade." George Washington would carry this local resolution to the statewide Virginia Convention in 1774, with a similar resolution passing there. We will neither ourselves import nor purchase any slave or slaves imported by any other person after the 1st of November next. 1774, later in that year, at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, George Washington would carry this resolution into the Continental Congress, and it would also be passed there, similar wording. So going back to the laws of Virginia's on slaves, in 1782, they finally get to a point where they pass a law that says, okay, you can free slaves, but it can only be done under very specific conditions, right? So the only way that it would work is that you could only free them when you died, you could only free them using a last will and testament, and you had to follow very specific rules in the way that you freed them. Now, the law was problematic for a number of reasons. One, it already hamstrung a slave owner because it's saying you couldn't free him until you died. Two, the law also said that, well, if any slave is considered young, old, weak, or infirm, you as the slave owner are responsible for the well-being of said slave if you free them. Meaning the colony was like, we're not going to cover this, you have to cover it, which made emancipation that much more difficult, because if you weren't a wealthy slave owner, like, how am I supposed to take care of these slaves that happen to be young, old, weak, or infirm? Right? And so to make things worse, freed slaves had to leave Virginia within 12 months or be forced back into slavery. Well, we know what happens during the period of slavery, right? You have men and women who are getting together, they're married for all intents and purposes, they're building families, So they're literally breaking up families in order for this to work. So the law was passed, and it was passed as a lenient take on slavery. It wasn't lenient at all, right? It was just doing its part to make it that much more difficult to free slaves. George Washington understood the nature of these laws, and he's like, I can't, the only way I can get out of this, the only out that the law gave you, sell the slaves. George Washington's like, I'm not going to do that because I don't want anything bad to happen to these people. So what he ended up doing was during his time, he's like, I'm going to make sure we take care of the slaves that we have. And we're going to provide for them. And we're going to do what we can. And I'm going to make sure that upon my death, my last will and testament will be to free them. And that's exactly what he ended up doing. He would actually free all of his slaves at his death in his last will and testament. But again, the problem with Virginia law was that there were a total of 317 slaves on the Mount Vernon plantation. 123 of them were George Washington's. The remainder were Martha's. Martha could not get rid of those slaves. She couldn't free them because they were from her first husband who passed. So 123 slaves that were purely of the ownership of George Washington were set free at his death. And not only that, he made sure as part of his last will and testament that they would be given an estate to be provided for, meaning for all of their needs, they would be taken care of for perpetuity. What history tells us is that most of the slaves that Washington freed after Washington died and they had his monument and where his grave was, would come back to his grave to continue to maintain it, to clean it, to make it look good, because they understood what this man was trying to do for them. And so a former slave who became a pastor and founder of America's first black denomination, his name was Richard Allen. You know, I want to read you a quote from his message to his congregation, where he says this about the passing of Washington. He says, our father and friend is taken from us. He whom the nation honored is seen of men no more. We, my friends, have peculiar cause to bemoan our loss. To us, he has been a sympathizing friend and tender father. He has watched over us and viewed our degraded, afflicted state with compassion and pity. His heart was not insensible to our suffering. Whose wisdom the nations revered thought we had a right to liberty, unbiased by the popular opinions of the state in which is the memorable Mount Vernon. He dared to do his duty and wipe off the only stain with which man could ever reproach him, by freeing his slaves, right? That's what he would end up saying. And so, you know, from there, right, you would also have Frederick Douglass, like we're familiar with Frederick Douglass, right? So he's also a former slave, taught himself how to read. He would end up counseling 4 presidents and would serve in federal office after the Civil War. He would write this about Washington. He would say, the patriots of the American Revolution clearly saw, and with all their inconsistency, they had the grace to confess the abhorrent character of slavery and to hopefully predict its overthrow and complete extirpation, which is the same word for abolition. Washington and Jefferson, Patrick Henry and Luther, Martin, Franklin and Adams, Madison and Monroe, and a host of the earlier statesmen, jurists, scholars, and divines of the country were among those who looked forward to his happy consummation. George Washington can never be claimed as a fanatic or as the representative of fanatics. The slaveholders impudently used his name for the base purpose of giving respectability to slavery. Yet in a letter to Robert Morris, Washington used this language which, at this day, would make him a terror of the slaveholders. There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see some plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. And he was quoting Washington in his letter to Robert Morris, and so that was Frederick Douglass. And so, yes, what did this happen? Of course it did. The problem is the revisionist history that you typically find is that Washington was a proponent of slavery, that he advocated for slavery, that he wanted things to stay the same. The historical record says that couldn't be further from the truth. The problem is when you have to deal with history, you have to deal with it in the context of when it was happening. Slavery was normal during this time period. Not saying that it was right, it was normal, right? The problem with reading into a 17th century perspective with a 21st century perspective, you can't do that because the perspectives were different. So you have to understand the circumstances. So the reason I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that is because it's important that we understand that, yes, this was something that was part of Washington's history, but also something that he went out of his way to make sure that he could find a way to solve, right? And did his own part in demonstrating that by freeing his own slaves on his death. Now, when we look at his presidency, right, There's a number of things that Washington established that continue today. So if you think about the executive branch and the cabinet, that started under Washington, right? So Washington established different offices, right, with the fledgling Constitution that made up the executive branch. He only had 4 at the time, and it expanded, since that time, right? But it started with that initial executive branch and its cabinet. He would go on, and this is crazy, he would be the one to establish a 6-member Supreme Court and the position of the Attorney General in 1790. So the Supreme Court would start under the auspices of Washington, right? Hamilton would help him to create the first Bank of the United States in 1791. That would become a thorn between Hamilton and Jefferson, and we'll touch on that when we talk about Jefferson, because I'm not going to mix things. I'll just keep going. He establishes the first federal Thanksgiving in 1789. So the actual federally observed holiday of Thanksgiving, Washington was the one that said we should do that. The U.S. Navy, the construction and the authorization of the U.S. Navy would begin with Washington in 1794. And then lastly, he would sign treaties with Great Britain, Spain, and North African nations in 1795 and 1796. Now, the treaty with Great Britain, which is called the Jay Treaty, that will end up becoming something that would come back to bite Washington in later presidencies, not during his presidency, but in subsequent presidencies, the Adams presidency, and then again in the Jefferson presidency. And we'll get to that in subsequent weeks. But the Treaty of Tripoli, which is the one with the North African nations, that's interesting, because I always wondered, like, whenever you hear the song sang, right, from the shores to Tripoli, I always okay. So, like, as a relatively younger guy, it was just kind of cool to kind of put those pieces together. But yeah, so that treaty was the Treaty of Tripoli that Washington would sign. It would open up the Mediterranean to the U.S. for trade and commerce. So, and a lot of these were signed to maintain peace and friendship. Those are the main things, but also to open up commerce opportunities with the United States. So in the time that we have left, this is what I want to dig into. I want to dig into his farewell address, because there's so much in his farewell address that as I start putting them on the screen, you're going to be like, no way. Like, how are we still doing this kind of stuff, right? So he would write this as he put this together, right? So, where are we at? Okay, so he declines a 3rd term, right? He sets the 2-term precedent that becomes part of the Constitution. They would end up passing a constitutional amendment that would say that a president can only serve 2 terms. It starts because Washington set the stage by saying, he could have continued to serve, right? He was so loved by the people that he could have served a 3rd, maybe even a 4th term, right? We know later on in history that there are presidents who tried to serve multiple terms, and that's what necessitated the need for the constitutional amendment to be passed to limit that. But when he declines this 3rd term, he writes his farewell address to the nation in 1796. And so when he does this, right, there's 4 pillars that I'm going to cover that sum up the farewell address, right? And so the first pillar, it's probably not going to be surprising, but for Washington, the first thing that he wanted to remind the young nation is that you should be a proud American and work to preserve national unity, right? And yeah, I said this last week, but it bears repeating. Being patriotic is not a bad thing. We defined patriotism last week, right? And so, but the thing is, it's not meant to be a blind loyalty. Does this country have plenty of faults? Of course it does. It doesn't mean that you gloss over them. But there is no other country like the United States in the world. And so as a result of that, there should be nothing wrong with being patriotic, having a love of country and wanting to see it improve, right? Which is what the definition of patriotism is. There's absolutely something to be proud of. So Reagan, he would capture this sentiment, and in one of his speeches, he would say these things. And I just want to read you what he says, because it makes a huge amount of sense when you listen to it. So he would say this. He goes, true patriotism is a love of country, but it must be an intelligent love and not blind devotion to one's nation without regard to its ideals. The earlier generations, loved their country because it was theirs, but even more because it was a land where liberty, justice, and opportunity flourished. They did not love it because of its government, but because of its people, not because of the role its government played in world affairs, but because of the inspiration the very idea of America gave to every person, great and small, who made this blessed land his home, and looked to America as the land of freedom. Americans today should dedicate themselves again to that true patriotism. This is what Reagan would write. And so we find ourselves today living in a society that completely turns this pillar on its head, that says that you shouldn't be proud of your country, that every opportunity is made to disparage and to tear down the country. We have political ideologies that are doing just that, that says that everything about America is wrong and it needs to be erased. But again, for Washington, he knew that what was important to keep the nation together was the shared commonality that we had as Americans, right? And this idea that we should look to be united together as a result. He would say this as he's writing. He would say, the name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manner, habits, and political principles. And so when he's saying this, the word appellation there means titles, right? So it's like, don't worry about titles, and local discrimination means regional differences. And that's important because as you speed up into the Civil War, you're going to see that those regional differences, those local discriminations, as Washington would tab it, would end up coming to the forefront, completely deviating from the principle that Washington had laid out. This idea that this is a common thing. To be an American is something that we should all be proud of. And this, again, he says, exalting with a just pride, right? Not blind pride, not egregious pride, but a just pride of patriotism that is above any title or difference of where you are, north, south, east, or west, right? We were joking earlier in the week on Friday in our small group where the folks who had come from California, and they had said that they refer to California as the People's Republic of California, and I kind of chuckled, and I'm like, but again, it's this idea that you have these distinctions that have developed over time, right? As opposed to viewing that, okay, we happen to be in California, but we're still American, right? We happen to be in New York, but we're still American. We happen to be in Texas, but we're still American, right? It's making sure that we're careful not to elevate those other things above the fact that we are American above all else, right? And that's what Washington was getting at. Because he knew that people would try to divide us based on these differences, right? And so that actually lends itself into the second pillar that he would talk about, right? So the second pillar that he would talk about in his speech, and I'm going to put it up there, you're going to read it, and it's going to jump right off the page. To avoid intense partisanship and polarization, reject loyalty to party or group above loyalty to the nation and the Constitution. That just jumps off the page, right? He's writing this in 1796. Here we are in 2026. And we are so not following this, right? We're not following this at all. And so polarization's at an all-time high. Like in the last 10 years, like I have been stunned at the level of tribalism that we have seen in this country, both from a political party level, from an affiliation level, from an ideology perspective. It is mind-boggling to me that this is where we are. And it's to the point where you can't even have a conversation with the other side because they're already looking at you like you are the enemy. Like this is what has happened. And Washington knew that how dangerous this was going to be, because what he was basically saying, right, is that we shouldn't try and like burn the country down through partisanship. That wasn't to say that parties weren't popping up in Washington's time. Now they weren't formal parties, but the two major, I guess, factions, if you will, and to Washington's credit, when he actually started the presidency and built his cabinet, he purposely put Federalists and Anti-Federalists together to serve in his cabinet. And he did that on purpose. Because for him, it didn't matter what you ascribed to. Your duty was to country. Your duty was to the nation. Your duty was to its people. And so the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and we'll get to that next week when we talk about when we go talk about Adams, which will get exacerbated when we get to Jefferson. But essentially, the short answer of Federalists and Anti-Federalists during the time, the Federalists were ones that felt that a strong national government was beneficial, whereas the anti-federalists would say we need to limit the centrality of a government and make sure that most of those rights and privileges and execution are reserved to the states. That's what the anti-federalists believed. So they are very much anti-government, anti-big government, I should say. And a federalist would, for all intents and purposes, be a big government proponent. And so you kind of see that as you fast forward into today, but the shades of both federalists and anti-federalists. But that's what Washington was dealing with at the time. But it didn't matter to Washington. As far as Washington was concerned, we are here to serve the people. We want to see this nation survive. We've been blessed with this nation. Let's care, feed, and take care of it, right? And so when he thinks about, as he's writing this, right, it's this idea that he was acutely aware of the danger that partisanship and parties would have on the country. And so when he phrases this, right, he says this, right? Hold on, is it coming up? Okay. So he says this, he goes, the basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists until changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. As far as Washington was concerned, he's like, listen, this document is not simply a document that tells us how the country is supposed to operate. There's a reason that this document was put together. And so we should subject ourselves to it, and only when it's absolutely necessary to amend the Constitution. Not burn it down, but amend it. Follow the processes that have been laid out to change or add to the Constitution, which has happened multiple times in its history, right? Abolishing slavery, 13th Amendment, right? And many others. So the idea is that he's trying to tell them that, look, there is a relationship between the people and the Constitution. Don't lose sight of that. Subject yourselves to it and trust that this is what is going to be to our best benefit, is if we allow ourselves to follow the Constitution. I mean, just think about today, where the Constitution is now optional, right, in most cases. Like, you'll have people that are putting forward policies, positions, and even potential laws that are running directly counter to what the Constitution says. Again, a far cry from what Washington was laying out when he was making this case in his farewell address. And he would continue. He would say this, talking about the people who would come up and become people who would leverage the idea of party to the detriment of the nation. He would say this. He goes, they, meaning the people who would do this, are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. That's words from 1796 that are just as relevant today. Especially when we've seen, especially in the last, like I said, in the last decade. And so it's just, again, it's shocking to me because, again, this goes back to what I said before. Many people, including those who serve in some sort of political office, don't typically know their history. I'm willing to bet most of them have not read Washington's farewell address. Even though, technically speaking, every year they actually read Washington's farewell address in the Senate. Whether they're listening, I don't know. But they actually do this every year. So, I'm sorry, it was a bit of a rabbit trail, right? But he goes on to talk about this idea, this spirit of party and how dangerous it is, right? So I can't fit the quote on the screen, so I'm going to read it so that way you can hear it. He goes, let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. Generally, this spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty, without looking forward to an extermity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight. The common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Washington is writing this in 1796. As I was reading that, I could hear as people are hearing me read it, it's like, oh my gosh, yes, that's happening. Yes, that's happening, right? But that's the bottom line. George Washington was making clear that the biggest dangers were putting party or tribe above the nation. But we're seeing that in living color today, right? So the other pillar the third pillar here, and this is something that George Washington did a lot to keep America neutral, was to keep American interests first and avoid foreign entanglements, right? Again, something that you see that makes sense, 1796, right? Multiple times, because the French had helped America against the British during the War for Independence, right? So what the French what the French expected was that we, in turn, would help them fight the British. Now, George Washington was like, no, we're not going to do that. We're gonna stay right here, right in the middle. We're not going to do anything with y'all, with France, and we're not going to do anything with Britain. We won, we got our independence, we're going to run it right down the middle. We don't need to be involved here. And he would write, at length about this. But he wasn't saying that we should be isolationists. That wasn't his intention. But rather, he was cautioning what would happen if the country got too involved in foreign affairs. And if we did, it would become to our detriment. Just think about in modern history, how many times that we've gotten tangled in foreign affairs and how that hasn't exactly helped us, right? A departure from what Washington was talking about back in 1796, right? And so he would say this in reference to this in terms of being neutral, right? Observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. A passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils, right? And so again, Washington, as he's making this, it's like he was ahead of his time as he's writing this address, right? It's almost as if he had a crystal ball where he was going to see where the country was veering to. And it's not an accident that he started to write this then, because he started to see pieces of it during his own time period. So it's not that these things are new, it's just they've been accelerated and exponentially exacerbated because of how crazy things have become over time. Primarily because most people don't understand their history and have not read and understood what the expectations were of this country in terms of how we were supposed to operate and conduct ourselves, right? And so, we're running out of time. So let me get to our last pillar here, right? So the last pillar, this probably shouldn't surprise you. George Washington said, don't let the government become secularist, right? Well, what does it mean to be a secularist, right? It's someone who advocates for the separation of religion from public, social, and political institutions. Well, just think about how far we've fallen from that. When you think about looking at the history of the country, and I did this in part 1, there's so much influence of Christianity throughout government. In public displays, you had calls to prayer, you had calls to worship, you had call for Thanksgiving, you would have worship services happening in the Capitol, you would have people praying in the houses of Congress and in the Senate. It was very open and honest because they understood that these were the things that we were supposed to do, right? For George Washington, he was a man who was intimately aware of and believed in the God of the Bible, and he realized how influential its ideals were on the founding of the country, right? And so you gotta listen to how he says this, right? And I'm gonna put this on the screen. It's not the entire quote. I'm gonna read the entire quote, but he goes, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Now, Washington's writing this, but you got to see, because it's not the entire quote, but if you look at his entire quote here, right? He says, observe good faith and justice towards all religions, cultivate peace and harmony with all, religion and morality. Oh, sorry, wrong page. Yep, 73, thank you. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these finest props of duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity or happiness. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience, both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. 'Tis substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundations or the fabric? So as far as Washington was concerned, this is how he put it together. And I mentioned this in week one, but this whole idea that this concept of separation of church and state being enshrined is a perversion of what it actually was meant to be and a complete misread of the historical record. Now, again, I say that not to say that this needs to be a theocratic nation. That is not the intent. What I am saying is that there is absolutely nothing that prevents or should prevent us from being able to openly express our faith in all areas of society, both private, public, and secular, right? So this idea that professions of faith or expressions of religion are only within the religious square is completely at odds with the historical record, right? So this idea of being able to pray in school, read your Bible, do these things as a public expression of faith are not things that are meant to offend. They are things that are anchored in our history. However, they have been completely co-opted by a different narrative that says, no, separation of church and state dictates that there is this wall between religious expression and public expression, and never the two shall meet. The historical record couldn't be further from the truth. Washington made it abundantly clear that the benefits of the nation are indisputably linked to religion and morality, and that everything, all the blessings that a nation has are tied to these things. We, as a people who know and have placed our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, have a tremendous opportunity to help guide conversations around this, to help people understand that there is something more to what we have here in this country, and it comes from the person, Jesus Christ, who has given us the opportunity to do these things, right? And so I leave us with this because that's the fourth pillar, and we are literally out of time. But what we're going to do in the next few weeks is, as we look at the next few presidents, we're going to anchor what they do in their presidencies against these four pillars. And we'll be able to see the departures, whether departing away from or doubling down on these pillars, how well they did it, or how much harm their deviations actually had on the country. So let me close this here. Father in heaven, thank you again for this time that we have to go through this. We thank you for the way that we can look at history and just be in awe of it, and to see your hand through it. We cannot wait to continue going through this. We ask that you would just be with us now. Those of us who are going to second service, that you would bless our time together, and those who are heading home or heading elsewhere, we just pray that you would be with them as well. We pray these things in your name. Amen.